You're welcome to another edition of our study in creative writing. We've talked about a number of things so far, especially relying on what we should be very familiar with as we do creative writing before we get into it itself. So we've talked about getting very familiar with language itself. A rather addicting sensibility to language must be something we develop as creative writers. And then we should be very, very studious of all forms of text, all forms of cultural productions, all sorts of motifs that will aid our creative sensibilities. Today, we'll be extending that frontier of pre-writing, requirements that will really aid us in doing effective creative writing. At this point, I'll be talking about the audience you are writing for. Audience matters a lot, and the audience that we see is not one. We might be looking at a crowd, but they constitute several publics. They have interests, they have ideas, they have orientations that differ from ours. But if you mean to circulate a particular message to several publics, I've told us about the use of language and versatility in communicating. I've told us about how to be intertextual, so to speak, in the way we communicate. This time around, we have to be very, very deliberate about the audience we are writing for, or perhaps the audience we even mean to convert to our own side. So imagine you are talking to a whole nation. You are writing a text, or you're making, let's say England or the US, or you are making a continent like Europe or Africa, or you are making a class orientations like fishermen or novelists or academics as your audiences, about a particular subject matter. How are you going to get that around? The basic thing about linguistic communication is to be simple enough for anybody. So if you are looking at something, a kind of subject matter that is going to cut across a number of publics, your best way of going about that is to be simple enough and be nuanced in the way you try to affect their several life orientations within a particular known society. For instance, you want to talk about the crisis of the neoliberal economy of the world today. And you want to talk about how somehow, despite globalization, we still have subtle class divides based on how we can generate income or how we can be accepted or ignored within certain privileges that might present ourselves. The best way to go about that is to be very, very simple with your language. Make sure that what you are saying will be understood by the fisherman, understood by the academic, understood by, anybody. But then you can bring in, and that's why we've talked about understudying successful writers or cultural producers and their text. You know how to navigate language. I don't know in any society where you mean to be satirical that the fisherman, the tanner, the professor, the clergy will not be suspended into opera if you know your onions in how to satirize. Some very remarkable satirists I've read include people like Narayan of India, R.K. Narayan in India. If you have read his The Horse and Two Goats, you can't drop that text without laughing. It has to do with the protagonist who is Tamil Indian and an American, who both meet. They seem to be transacting with different languages, but they are actually miscommunicating in imaginary communications. When the American speaks his English to the Tamil protagonist, he assumes the American is saying something that he is imagining, and he answers the American who couldn't understand his Tamil language in such a way that the American also misperceives what he's trying to say. It is a caricature of coloniality, of nativism, of the idea of cultural stagnancy celebrated in tradition and all that, and the plight of imagined arrival of capitalist modernity. Although it starts from a seriousness of, lack of capacity based on the Indian family that this Tamil protagonist comes from. They lack the income, the power, to make some very incomparable. And this gets into the next phase of the short story, which involves this American and all that. What happens is that by the time you are through with R.K. Narayan, you just keep laughing. Some other satirists have existed that have been in world history that you can look at, and when you look at a number of films, you can gain a number of satiric skills through some comedies, through cartoon, graphic literatures, as you find them in cartoons and so on and so forth. So these things will help you. So you will be able to communicate with any level of people. So far, they are human beings within a society where it's particular subject matter cuts across everybody. So we've got to understand our audience. Now, there are some particularized audiences we might be aiming at. What if you are writing for a youth audience of, let's say, around 10 years old to 13 years old? How do you write to them? And you are trying to talk to them about climate change. You want to get the politics of climate change to them. How are you going to do that? You can't write like a philosopher to that age group. You can't. You are going to have to explain. You might create a scenario where, people enjoy nature and they inhabit the natural, sphere of an environment which produces culture, some cultural consistencies or behaviors that are, shared by that community. And then you are going to try to make that production such a way that it is endearing to the audience. But all of a sudden, you begin to develop crisis, ecological crisis, maybe by the intrusion of a particular company in their rural area, signed by a particular government, to a multinational company that begins to erode their ecological structures in that society. This will stop the opportunities of some families, some young boys and girls. It's going to change their attitude to life. It might begin to also introduce ideologies of stemming climate change and really encouraging people. You are not going to be able to do that by theorizing or by writing academically. Also, if your audience is going to be a basically academic audience, you might go philosophical. Your language might deliberately begin to adhere, to philosophies that have to do with eco-criticism, that have to do with globalization, a kind of multi-territorialities of globalization. You are going to also begin to perhaps look at the possibilities of inscribing the colonial, perhaps Marxist, and at times gendered orientations within that novel. By the way, that wouldn't mean you are going to be writing like an academic. You'll be writing your novel like an academic paper. No, there are ways in which you write that will echo the university classroom, so to speak, and also talk about the mainstream issues of the society you are trying to communicate to. Let me tell you about some people that have done that so fantastically. When you read them, you'll be interested in how some people could collapse an academic mentality with creative writing. For instance, there was a woman called Asia Jeba, Algeria. Read any of Asia Jeba's write-up, and you wonder if you are not reading post-colonial discourse, if you are not reading race discourse, if you are not reading, academic things like that, if you are not reading things that have to do with, things like Judith Butler, Gayatri Spivak, you think you are reading Omi Baba and all those iconic post-colonial writers. But to your shock, you are estranged to know that you are actually reading a novel. How she was able to merge academic writing with novelistic dexterity is part of what we are talking about, imaginative skill of the mind. how you bring the mind to do what you want to do. And of course, I am sure, of course, definitely, like I told us, intertextuality, you are indebted to some people you have been going after. Another one I can recall right away is Sudanese writer. Don't mind me. I might be talking inconsistently from a post-colonial, decolonial point of view in my lectures, but I think it's time for that, because most of what we've been consuming in terms of academics and creative, works and networks have been almost perpetually, Occidental, almost perpetually alignable, so to speak, to some Eurocentric consciousness of cultural and textual productions. So why not something coming from the margins? And I am hoping that in X-raying and projecting the margin, we are definitely not doing a disservice to a cosmos of, sharings of economies, of textuality, of creativities and all that, which we have really benefited also from the global north, especially the West. So, but what we are now saying is that there are some iconic writers from the post-colonial world that have been doing some cerebral, amazing write-ups. How do you read somebody like Jamal Maktoum, for example, that Sudanese British writer that have consistently been writing on, how to problematize Europe as not just something that is self-contained, like in European world, as being apart from the worlds of his diaspora, But then it is a Europe that we love, that we want to see, that has humanized some worlds that were not European, but at the same time is composed of such worlds because of its diasporic orders. So if you read, for example, you read a novel like Traveling with Janes by Jamal Maktoum, you are going to see a mesh of fantastic image. You are going to see a mesh of fantastic imagery of the post-colonial blended with a fluid form of narrative that intersects mobile narratives, intersects gender, has to do with class, has to do with a politics of, the global north and the global south, has to talk about epistemology, intersects several kinds of philosophies, and at the same time, not just taking a particular philosophy or particular world as essentialist or, self-contained in itself. And all these things have to do with dexterities of writing. Now, if you were to go a little bit further, you read, I'm coming back to my dear Benjamin Zephaniah. He writes another way entirely. Or you are looking at somebody like Marlon James, who wrote a fantastic write-up, which he calls A Brief History of Seven Killings, an amazing title. You're going to discover that the language used and the way in which these writers interrogate coloniality and its vast extension, in the late capitalist, neoliberal, economic project of the world today, originated essentially from the West, you would discover that you are seeing another climb of writing from writers, that come from the post-colonial world. But then, what is very interesting to anybody, whether you are from the global north or the global south, you are from Africa or Asia or the US or Belgium, wherever you are coming in from, is that just like Johann von Goethe, that protagonist of world literature, will say that, look, poetry, for example, has the world as its own range. It belongs to anybody. And he began to feel that there is a need to, understudy our literatures, to ingest the world's literary phenomenon into everybody, so that there is really a kind of literary familyhood in the world. You will discover that anybody can interact and interface with any literature coming from anywhere. Some of the best literary protagonists and critical protagonists of even the colonial consciousness were Westerners. And we are very, very proud of them. People like Jean-Paul Sartre, we've talked about people like Roland Barthes, we've talked about Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Bourdieu, you just name them, Antonio Gramsci. Thanks to them, they gave us some things that have been actually sustainable towards today. So what we are saying is that productions of epistemes, so far they are healthy enough, can be consumed by anybody. The same thing goes for literature. And then in creative writing, all we need to know about audiences is to be able to get how they can be arrested from the outset as we present the literature, and how that arrest can be funneled up into the prison of your narrative that you want to suspend them into. That is the hallmark of creative writing. So you've got to know your audience, you've got to know the language you want to give them, and you want to also know the way you can nuance your creative projection so that it could be enjoyed perhaps by any other person that might not even be within your immediate audience. Audience can be very, very relative. What you call your audience might not even be yours, because if you are rating the audience appeal from a racial perspective, you might be shocked that that audience might not be yours at the level of class or at the level of gender. So the best thing we try to do is to accommodate all forms of orientations, but then successfully pass across our message to them. If we see creative writing as a form of message, a form of, let me use a Christian terminology, a form of evangelism to those that are not within our immediate range, and yet you mean to get them to your own message, then you have a lot of work to do. You've got to be very, very interesting yourself as a creative writer. You've got to be engaging. You've got to be able to get, the appeal of your audience right from scratch. And then you should be able to sell your message in such a way that it can circulate. One thing that makes a work die soon is the artificiality of its greenness. It dies very slowly when the challenge of changing times or changing tastes come to it. It dies off. But if you can make yours green from scratch and evergreen, you are going to be accommodative in the way you circulate or you interact with your imaginary audience, to the extent that it could be hopefully broadened and then get into shows that perhaps you have never even met, but are going through the same thing. Why is Chinua Achebe a kind of global success? Even though in Things Fall Apart, most of the imagery and linguistic devices it uses are consistently Igbo, that is, coming from an ethnic group within Nigeria called Igbo. But then Achebe is read anywhere in the world, and he has been celebrated up till now. Even when Things Fall Apart became 50 years old, that text was given a birthday celebration. How many of us have celebrated particular years? Things Fall Apart got celebrated everywhere in the world. Got celebrated in the UK, in the US, in Nigeria, everywhere. In India, name it. Because this is a man that was able to use what he had to appeal to several publics. And it makes a kind of resonance that is very appealing up till today. Ladies and gentlemen, we are continuing with this series of creative writing. But the next time we meet, we are opening up to another skill that will begin to lead us to the actual beginnings of when and how to write. Thank you very much. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, make sure you share it, and make sure you like it. Thank you very much.